Good evening and welcome to this, our second episode of the South African Equestrian Federation's podcast from the horse's mouth. I will be your host this evening. My name is Georgie Roberts, and we're going to be discussing what should be one of the most exciting moments in every equestrian's life, and that is hopefully buying your first horse. And so we're going to talk a little bit tonight about the responsibilities, your rights, and the recommendations around what that entire process should look like. I'm very lucky tonight to have two experts sitting with me. The first is Janine Turner, our LLB. She is also on the SAEF Judicial Council. She is only a part-time lawyer, however, and she is a full-time horse lover. And then our veterinary expert for the evening is Dr. Patrick Martin from Baker McVeigh. Patrick, I think you've probably vetted more horses than I've even sat on, which is saying something. And it's really lovely to be speaking to both of them tonight. This would be a reminder to all of you to please leave any questions you might have in the comments section of the live stream. And also, if you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please email those to us at podcast@saef.org.za. And kicking off tonight, this whole episode really was inspired by a post I saw on Facebook by a breeder and seller called Marit van Rensburg, who was talking about the ethical issues that we often run into buying and selling horses in South Africa. And what should be a really wonderful and exciting experience leaves a really sour taste in a lot of horse people's mouths. And why this is an issue is because people end up leaving the equestrian fraternity as soon as they enter it. And obviously, I always say that the thing you should know about buying horses is you shouldn't. It's a terrible investment. Even the word investment should not be used here. But let's just kick off, I think, by talking, Janine, a little bit about why this is on the SAEF podcast at all, because the SAEF doesn't actually have any jurisdiction over the buying and selling of horses in South Africa.
No, Georgie, they wouldn't. I think from the SAEF's perspective is we would like to provide our athletes with as much information as we can. The SAEF would only ever have jurisdiction over any kind of buying and selling of a horse if there was a welfare issue. So if there was a welfare of the horse issue, the SAEF would then potentially step in. But other than that, we would not be interested in the commercial transaction between a buyer and a seller.
And that would also depend, I'm sure, which is another reason why people should be keen to be part of the registration process. It would also only depend on if everyone was registered.
That's
with
correct.
The South African Equestrian Federation.
It would mean the buyer would have to be a registered athlete, the seller would have to be a registered athlete, and the horse in question would have to be on our database under one of the disciplines. Okay. So if those three factors weren't there, we wouldn't have jurisdiction in any event. Okay. But I think for us, it's more a case of trying to educate our athletes, trying to give them as much information as possible to make good decisions.
Okay. I just do want to point out to everybody on the podcast that we are now in subscribers-only comments mode. You don't have to pay to subscribe. Please subscribe, join the podcast, leave a comment. Okay, so moving on, something that was mentioned is the Consumer Protection Act and how people could come after disreputable sellers. As far as I gather, that doesn't exist.
Well, I think it's a very grey area. Even in Europe, it's quite a grey area as to whether the Consumer Protection Act would apply. And in South Africa particularly, if you have a look at the Act and what it tries to do, it talks about consumers, who are consumers, and consumers are defined in terms of goods and services. Yep. Then if we look at what goods and services are, the question is, well, would a horse be considered a good? And if you look at the definition of a good, it doesn't fit in anywhere. I think the only possibility would be a tangible object, which they talk about. And strangely enough, if you look at tangible, something I can see, feel, so there it would fit in. But object, live animals aren't seen as objects. So then I think it's a grey area. It hasn't been tested yet. I actually spoke to the Consumer Protection Tribunal and asked them. I also searched, due to
and they said, please don't bring horses into this. Please,
well, the first question they asked was like, what happened? Nothing's happened. I was just curious to know whether there would be any, would the Consumer Protection Act apply to me buying a horse or any animal for that fact? So I think it hasn't been tested. Very little has been tested even in terms of who a consumer is. You know, if you look at the Act, it talks about a consumer, but it talks about a consumer in direct relevance to goods and services.
Okay.
So unless it's a goods and services, you wouldn't even read consumer. And if you talk about consumables, unless you're going to eat the horse, which I don't think we're talking
I would
about right now.
recommend it. I think
No,
that's a
apparently
good-
not. But it wouldn't be a consumable. So I doubt that the Consumer Protection Act would apply. And who knows, maybe we'll see a case coming up where that gets tested.
Okay. So leading from that, if somebody is starting their journey and they want to go now, they've decided to buy their first horse, where's the best place for them to begin this journey? Because obviously the way this whole post even came about was on Facebook, and that seems to be a hotspot of selling horses. But ideally, where does the journey begin?
Well, ideally, I think you start talking to your trainer, you start talking to your instructor, your coach, maybe
Your
the
vet.
yard, your vet. Well, so you don't really get to know a vet until you actually own
And even
a
then,
horse.
geez, like Patrick, no offense, but even then, hopefully you don't get to know a vet too well.
Yes, no, it's an expensive acquaintance. But so you would go to your trainer, your instructor, your yard, speak to the people in the yard, and I would do as much homework as possible before even considering buying a horse, and consider what you want a horse for. You know, are you wanting a horse because you want to compete in show jumping, but you've never jumped before? Or do you want a happy hacker? Or so I think that's one of the most important things to ask. And actually one of the things we spoke about previously, and I'm sure Patrick will deal with it too, is you need to make sure that the person that you're asking advice from is not going to have a benefit from you buying a horse in any way. Because the minute that happens,
They're not impartial.
they're not impartial.
Yeah.
And you would be doubtful as to whether they are going to be handling you
And
in
looking
your
after
best
your
interest.
best interests.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing, you know.
Versus their own pockets.
So I think there are lots of channels that are available for people, and they should be looking at obviously established dealers,
Yep.
long-standing yards. Word of mouth is a great thing, but I think we really need to stress here that the onus is always on the buyer to investigate. Of course, the sellers have obligations, which we are going to discuss next, but as a buyer, you have to do your research on the horse and on the seller. And nobody's going to help you. You have to help yourself here, unfortunately. But let's move on. And Patrick, you also raised this, what the responsibilities of the seller are. So, you know, and I don't even know if we can discuss what the legal responsibilities are, but what should a seller ethically be doing in the process of selling a horse from a point of disclosure, advertising?
Okay, so interestingly enough, our case law on horses or latent defects or your duty to disclose on horses is very thin. We have a 1969 case, which was, I think it's for Melithan versus McDonald, and it went on to appeal.
If any of these people's grandchildren are around, please phone me because I need to know what happened here.
I know. Well, I don't want to go into the facts too much, but I think in essence, you know, it goes into the Roman Dutch law. So I brought my case with me, and that's how old the law is regarding horses. And they have a...
Roman Dutch law is the basis of our legal system, basically.
Yeah, our legal system is based on Roman Dutch law, some English law. Okay. We've got some legislation now where the law has been coded. But I'm just trying to see where it talks about... the term was van zessen klaar, and it means sound in feet and eyes. So in essence, it was to say that because latent defects on a horse are pretty visible to those who know horses, the only thing that you could misrepresent on or that you have a duty to ensure that you advise on is whether the horse has sound feet, 4 sound feet, and not blind.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
And that's
quite
it.
broad.
Patrick, it is quite broad.
We can just fire you. I mean, anyone can see a horse has 4 feet and 2 eyes.
Very easy.
So unfortunately, in this case, at the end of the day, the court said because the person had claimed not misrepresentation, the seller had not claimed or the buyer had not claimed misrepresentation, which is a whole different avenue of law, but it actually claimed that he had a duty to disclose the habit of the horse, and the habit of the horse was... Well, no, it was the fact that the horse used to put its tongue over the bit.
Is that the particular complaint? In
That
this
was the
case?
complaint, is that the horse put its tongue over the bit, and that made it impossible for the buyer to ride the horse. And the buyer wanted to do a bit of hunting, maybe a bit of show jumping and dressage.
So certain death away. And what was the outcome of that, for example?
Well,
If the
on
seller-
appeal, the court said no. The court said the only duty he has is to disclose 4 feet, 2 eyes. So if there's blindness or soundness issue, that has to be disclosed.
Okay.
But with regards to the vice and that, doesn't have to be disclosed.
So we're sitting here trying to say that the responsibilities of a seller are to honestly represent the horse, but actually at the end of the day,
It's up to the buyer.
That's a pretty vague.
It is. And unfortunately, that is all we have to date. So unless there is a court case in terms of which they try and
Please
use the
don't
consumer...
invite litigation.
No, Consumer Protection Act to see whether it does apply or not. Or unless this gets rewritten or there's another case which either broadens it or decides that in selling horses there should be further duties on the seller. This is what we've got.
Okay, so moving on, I think you've made the decision hopefully to buy your horse from a reputable person who, if you know one, you're very lucky. You're hoping that this person is going to be open in disclosing what is good and bad about the horse. Moving on to Patrick, in the vetting, what is the purpose of vetting your horse?
Georgie, I think for me, the process starts long before you actually get to the horse's side. I have untold discussions with the buyer. I need to know what they want to do, what they're expecting,
Absolutely.
what level they're riding at. Do they know what the horse is doing at the moment? Have they checked the competition record? And once I know that, I've got an idea about what I need, how fine I call it, our mesh should be, and what I'm going to tolerate
That's great.
for it to go through, and what isn't.
Yeah.
If the horse needs to walk around the block twice a week with a young kid sitting on it, well, then if it's got a cataract in a right eye, it's probably, as an example, not the end of the world. If the horse needs to go and jump in the 150 classes, that's a different story. And then little anomalies can become exaggerated and trying to get that horse to that level. But if a horse is competing or hacking at a very lower level, then a lot more is tolerable. So for me, it's about knowing, it's so important to know before you get to the horse what this horse needs to do. I also, when I get to the horse, I will ask the owners, if the buyer, if they're there, preferably they're there, what the horse is doing, are they happy with the way the horse is going, why they're selling the horse. Always a few interesting stories there. I've read them all.
What's been your best reason for selling a horse?
Beware the daughter who's at university and why the horse is standing.
Janine has a daughter at university, but there was a queue for your horse, to be fair.
So once you've established that, then you know immediately when you see the horse in front of you. And look, purchase price shouldn't come into it. Value is in the eye of the beholder, like beauty. It shouldn't, but it does, because that old saying that if it's too good to be true, it probably is.
So it's interesting, you're coming from having a low, and that is something that was in Marette's post, as she said, if you're getting a great deal, you definitely should look the gift horse in the mouth.
100%. No, I get very nervous. Just yesterday, I was asked to look at a horse, look at x-rays and my opinion on a horse in Europe. And I replied to the client that my nose was twitching. Something's not adding up there. So I shouldn't be so skeptical, but I found for some reason, I've ended up, as you say, I vet far too many horses. But it's a job I enjoy doing because the way I see it, it's a willing buyer, willing seller.
It's almost like veterinary CSI, Patrick.
Yeah. Well,
like uncovering,
you shouldn't be such a pessimist, but I have to be sometimes. But you've got a willing buyer, willing seller, and I'm there to facilitate the sale. I'm not there to stand in the way of it.
You're like a mediator. You're there
Exactly.
for the
I'm here
best
to
of
say,
everyone.
it's show me a reason why this horse shouldn't pass, not show me a reason why it should pass. And I do think sometimes we get a bit too caught up in clinical exams,
Fault finding,
particular fault finding, and then obviously we discussed earlier flexion tests and x-rays.
So let's discuss quickly like the role that flexion tests and x-rays would play. And one of the analogies that spoke to to my soul is if someone did a flexion test on me, I would be shot. So, you know, when someone explained it like that, I went, oh, well, maybe then, you know, are we investing too much in flexion tests?
I think it's all in the interpretation.
That's great. Yeah.
It's all in the interpretation. You must remember we only have an hour and a half, probably max, at the horse's side. I have going to Port Elizabeth tomorrow to vet 2 horses. I only have probably an hour and a half at the horse's side. To try and elicit it sounds terrible, any weakness out of the horse. I don't have the time to go and watch it compete last weekend before I vet it this week or whatever. So from that point of view, a judiciously done flexion test, we're not trying to lame the horse, we're just trying to stress the joints out and watch the horse trot out. If the horse trots out sound, that's fine. If the horse trots out a little bit off for a few strides, in my eyes personally, if everything else is fine, that's fine. And it's also, as I say, interpretation. If one flexion test is positive, but the other 3 are negative, immediately I start to get a little bit suspicious as why. Because some horses are jointy and they'll go sore on all 4 legs.
Exactly.
And then I don't worry too much about that. And I use it as a pointer. It's one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. It's not the deciding factor. I will always carry on a vetting if it has a positive flexion test. Invariably, if it has a significant positive flexion test, when you get to the ridden phase, it's probably going to start. If there's absolutely no lameness in the ridden phase, you've got to go back and question that flexion test and go, well, was that a real reading, or should I repeat that afterwards and go, actually, maybe I just caught the horse off
And again, I think when you say it's part of a holistic examination, a positive flexion test on maybe both front legs in an older horse that's done a lot of jumping is a very different thing to a 4-year-old. So,
absolutely, 100%. So if I am flexing a 4-year-old and it goes off lame on one leg and there's a little bit of a fetlock distension, I'm going, not ideal. Okay. But if I'm vetting a horse that's jumping in the 130s, 140s, and it's 12 years old, it's probably going to be feeling a bit, and I'm not going to overinterpret those flexion tests. Okay. So it goes back to what I said at the beginning. You need to know what's standing in front of you and how to interpret the X-rays. It's the same with X-rays. You know, if you've got significant changes on X-rays in a young horse, you have no record to judge that horse against and whether he's going to stand up to work. If you see subtle change in a 12-year-old that's jumping in the 140s, you know the horse is coping with that. So you're far more tolerant of that. You're like, he's coping with that. It's probably going to be all right. Yeah. So from that point of view, again, the X-rays, occasionally you will look at, if I don't see the horse in front of me, I much prefer, but obviously sometimes I see X-rays from Europe. I don't have the horse in front of me. And one tends to err on the side of caution because you can't see the horse.
No, totally.
But if I'm trotting the horse up and down, I know the horse's record and I know everything. I trust the seller. I might know the seller, might even be a client of mine, and I know the horse, then I'm likely to tolerate a lot more.
Okay. And there were a few things that were raised across a few posts lately that have come up, and one of them was talking about this: don't buy the X-rays, buy the horse. You know, and people were saying 30 years ago when we couldn't X-ray everything, we were buying horses a lot more, I don't want to say freely, and they were saying, are there really worse ramifications? Were there worse ramifications then than there were now? Were there more unsound horses then? And you know, I don't suppose we really have any statistics to go on, but
I think it's difficult, but to ignore changes on X-ray in a horse that looks possibly vulnerable, i.e. a young horse that hasn't done anything, is risky. And that's what it all comes down to, is risk. What are you prepared to take? Risk. None of us have crystal balls. If the horse vets sound but has bad X-rays, we don't know how that's going to play out. And then once that horse comes under pressure and starts going through the grades and the classes, it's going to get to a 7-year-old, and maybe those changes only show themselves then. So as long as that buyer is aware of our eyes wide open and aware of the risk, for me, that's the most important. You know, if they tell me they're remortgaging the house, this is the be-all and end-all, and there are changes, then I'm trying to steer them away. I'm going, I can't tell you that this horse is going to stay sound. But if they're getting it on the cheap and they go, listen, we're going to try and flip this horse on another sale, and I go, well, if you understand the risk involved here, then this is a low, medium, or high risk, and you must decide on your risk status as to whether you can accept that risk or not.
And with the risk, I think the next step is really not necessarily that we're vetting, and we discussed this before we started. In the good old days, listen to me, but we used to talk about passing or failing horses, whereas now you said, like, we're talking more about risk. It's almost more a case of knowing, as you said, going into a relationship with the horse with your eyes open and knowing the maintenance or the care the horse is going to require.
I think it's very important. Again, it goes back to what you need to do. A lot of the clients that I'm vetting for already have their horse on maintenance programs. They're injecting joints to keep them at the top of the game. I know with this podcast, we were talking not specifically, but aimed at first-time buyers. And so those people need to be educated as to what may be needed. I know if they're a first-time buyer, maybe they've had a horse on lease before, but they may not be at that level where they're going to require maintenance injections into their horses or things going to go wrong.
Shockwave.
Yeah, I mean, the list is endless, but they need to be aware that, okay, you're taking this horse, and I think this is something that I've tried to do a lot in my vettings, is just because a horse is not perfect in the vetting, and that doesn't matter whether it's in the vetting itself or on the x-rays or on the flexion test, can the transaction still go through? How can I facilitate the transaction? And one of the ways is to speak to the buyer and say, listen, there are some changes on the hocks here, or in a fetlock or in a coffin joint. The horse is sound now, but if it goes wrong, this is what we can do.
Are you prepared to?
And I will often have that conversation in front of the seller, with the implication being that if there's a negotiation to be had, it's not fair on the buyer to take on that purchase price and then pay for treatment. So I will very often say, there is a discount to be negotiated here because there is a risk. That discount should reflect cost of treatment for a few years, added risk the buyer is taking on.
Totally.
And I regard myself as a reasonably lenient vet in terms of vettings. Realistic is probably the word.
I was going to say practical.
Yeah, practical. I don't just walk and fail everything.
I do remember speaking to you about one of my client's horses, and I said, the client wants to know if the horse is going to go Grand Prix, and you said, is the client going to go Grand Prix?
Yeah.
So I think that's the point.
So from that point of view, as long as they are eyes wide open, I tell them, take that whatever R1,000 and put it under their pillow. And if they have vet fees in the next years, they save that at the time of the purchase.
Okay.
So, but they need to understand that if there are changes, I will always try and get a deal through. But buyer and seller need to understand what it's going to cost to get that deal through.
And I think we're going to tie that together a little bit later, talking about the purchase agreement, which you would like everyone to really be involved in. And Patrick, when it comes to veterinary records, I always get the feeling that it's almost like a bit of a dirty ask to ask a seller for veterinary records for this history of the horse. I mean, that should be a fairly open thing that we should be able to go and request if we're buying a horse, that we get the full, as far as this.
100%.
Okay.
I would. My first advice to clients is, and that includes if I'm buying and selling in-house, because very often I'm vetting a horse that I'm a vet to both the buyer and the seller. And my first question is to the buyer who I'm working for, is to say, please request a clinical history. They might say they're buying from Joe Soap, who I know is a client of mine. I say, before you even tell me the name of the horse, I'd like to know, please get the clinical history, because I don't want to be pointed and say, oh, it's that horse, you need to get a clinical history. So you're well within your rights to, and I get very nervous. Again, my nose gets twitchy if a clinical history is not forthcoming, whether it's from myself and I'm not allowed to give it. And if I'm not allowed to give it, I recluse myself from the vet.
Okay, that's
because the only time it's not permission, if there's only vaccinations on there, it's always permission is given. But if there is stuff on there, and people shouldn't be scared of telling about, I don't run away if I see a horse that's had hocks injected 3 times in the last 3 years. I'm like, that's what that horse needs. That's nothing, So you must ask for clinical. It is the most important thing. I do think the veterinary certificate, pre-purchase exam certificate can be a bit limited in inquiring after detail.
But the last 10 years, definitely not. That's what's going to tell you
exactly. I mean,
what you're buying.
We have there that say, has it had medication the last 45 days? Which, we all know the horse may have had, surgery or colic surgery last year. And so there's a lot of limitations that we're working on. But yes, but 100%, the clinical history should I request my secretary to provide a clinical history in my folder when I'm doing it.
Okay. So yeah, I definitely think from and I don't know, perhaps we look at normalizing it within the equestrian fraternity, that this is more forthcoming from sellers, that there's maybe a competition history as well as this clinical history. And my next suggestion, which you've already covered really beautifully, was to identify a suitable horse for clients. We have to discuss who is the horse for and what is the horse's purpose going to be. And I think that's really great. Patrick, speaking again to the point of vetting, to identify the potential longevity of the athlete. We discussed this as well. If it's, and I think it's being normalized in Europe a little bit. Janine and I found a very interesting article from this Luke Schulstrata, which I will share in the comment section. He's actually an equine specialist lawyer who deals with sport horses exclusively. And they're normalizing now in Europe that the seller produces a full vet check before. So as they decide to sell their horse, they would get a vet out and do this vet check themselves. Why is that not done more? I think it also just eliminates these unpleasant surprises that sometimes come in. Oh my, that total shock that there's a chip or an issue.
That's a very good point, and I've tried to change. I actually work for quite a few people who sell horses regularly, both dealers and people who sell horses regularly. And I encourage them a lot to have a full set of x-rays done because I find it helps them because if you as a buyer need to travel a fair distance, that we all know that buyers are so scared of x-rays. They go, well, it passed the vetting, but it hasn't had the x-rays yet. Yeah. And then everyone wants to collapse in a heap. But if you can present a full set of x-rays and say, yep, I have confidence in the product I'm selling, here's a full set of x-rays, give them to your own vet to read. I normally, if I do x-rays for them, I will provide a written report, but I always encourage them, especially if there's some marginal lesions on the x-rays, okay, I'll encourage them to give them to their vet and say, get your own vet to interpret it. Your vet knows what your risk status is. What you're prepared to take a punt on or not. Yeah. Can this afford to go wrong for you or not? Your vet is best served to give you that advice and put the lesion to the risk status. So yes, I think it's been, and normally when I do that, I'll do that and I'll check eyes and heart and trot the horse up. I don't do a full vetting, but I'll make sure. It has happened to me before where I have done the x-rays before, and unfortunately I had to go back and vet the horse. It happened once, and the horse had a great big cataract in one eye, and that was the end of the vetting. Okay. And we'd gone to all the effort to take x-rays, but no one had bothered to look in the eye in a pre-vetting examination. So now if I do that, I take x-rays and I look in the eyes, listen to the heart for heart murmurs. That can also be a little bit of a trip up, and I'll just trot the horse up and down, no flexions, because somebody else is going to vet that horse. And they must decide in their vetting whether the horse is suitable or not.
I think we're seeing it a lot now also with the auction houses and the rise of auction houses. And this information is so freely available and readily available for anyone who wants to see it and have their own vet look at it. And I would urge anyone who's listening and who's interested, when we get to the point later about speaking about agreements, it's recommended to go and have a look at some of these breeders' disclosure agreements, I think, where they openly say that, you know, you're buying the horse as is and they're making as much available to you as possible. But they're not necessarily selling a catalog full of horses with perfect x-rays. The decision is still there for people to say, well, as you say, I'm prepared to take the risk or not. So commission is the dirty word that we have to discuss. There is no regulation for commission upfront, and there's no commission regulated anywhere in any industry ever.
No, I don't think there is. So commission would be very much based on seller-buyer.
So commission is basically if somebody finds a horse for you,
a finder's fee,
and it is a stress. And I mean, I've been given the runaround before with clients who want to find the perfect horse, and you take them to look at 82 horses, and then they buy one off of Facebook, and you want to kill yourself. So I do understand that for people who this is their job and they do that full time, that having a commission structure is what drives their business. But what are the pitfalls? Like what should people be wary about with commission with horses?
I think the first thing they need to be very, not wary of, but aware of, is to discuss commission up front. is to discuss who's responsible for commission, how much commission will be payable, who else is benefiting from the commission. You know, Patrick, you spoke about the commission chain. Sometimes it's more than one person who's going to get the commission or part of the commission. So be very clear of that upfront so that there are no surprises afterwards when you come and there's all of a sudden a commission payable. And is the commission payable, so it's 10% on the selling price, or is it the selling price plus 10%? You know, so I think that is one of the most important things, is when it comes to the buyer and the seller, they need to agree on the terms of their agreement. And I know we'll talk about it, but it's just saying that needs to be in writing. And the reason being is that the minute there's a verbal agreements are completely legal. That's not a problem. The problem is determining what were the terms of our verbal agreement. I say this, you say something else. So that's why I always say, put it in writing. Make it simple. Don't make it complicated, but put it in writing. Find out what the commission is. Make sure that there's provision in the agreement for how the commission works, when the commission is payable, who gets the commission, do you pay it, does the seller pay it? But have that up front before anything else happens. Before you take transfer of the horse, those things need to be sorted out. And one of the things you can actually also put in the agreement is to say that you will release all the horse's medical records to me, including all previous x-rays, medication, all of that things, so that you have it already in your possession. And it's not a case of now things have gone wrong. And rightfully so, the vets say, I'll give you the records from when you owned the horse, but the records before that belongs to the previous owner. And unless they've released it to you, and so that's why I would say, ask for all those medical records up front, have it in the agreement that you will give it to me.
Patrick, I really loved what you said about commission early on, which was you have to have an independent opinion when you're buying a horse.
Yeah.
And it must be someone who's excluded from the financial benefits of that sale. And I'm with you that I think there are many, many reputable dealers and coaches and everything out there. But to get the stamp of approval from someone who doesn't stand to make small profits off of you.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think that's correct. And look, I don't think that's in every case. There's a lot of cut and dried cases that we see where it's a totally suitable horse. There's one person in the commission structure, your instructor or whoever it is, that introduced you to the horse. And it doesn't happen often. But I do think if you're not sure and you've been back 3 times, the vetting is a little bit iffy maybe, and you're not sure, I think it's always helpful to take somebody who's outside the commission chain, just to say, you know, maybe your friend's instructor, and buy them a McDonald's lunch or a bottle of wine and say, please, can you just come over and have a look? I'm not going to hold you to it. What do you think of this horse? You know, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think it's human nature. I think if there's a sale on the table, then
totally,
you know, and you stand to benefit from it. I don't think there's too many people out there who are going to push a totally unsuitable horse onto their own client. I really don't believe that's the case.
So we don't want to teach people on that unsuitable horse.
100%. Yeah, you're going to end up riding it. So I don't believe it's a big problem. But I think when you are undecided and you've had sleepless nights, get an independent opinion. I think it's worth doing.
I always we were talking about it the other day, and I had this. I taught this elderly gentleman at one point who wanted a nice horse to hunt, and I was finding him these wonderful Boer pats and very suitable, like 12-year-old horses with a leg at each corner, and he was just going, doesn't like it. And he came with a 9-year-old horse off the track that had won 21 sprints. Its croup was about 2 inches higher than the wither, so it was like riding a slide. It was terrifying, and it was hot as Hades. And the horse, at least it did vet reasonably okay. But an interesting thing for me was chemistry. That was my first real going. It would be like me, your husband might be lovely, and Duncan is lovely, but I might not want to marry him. But anyone on the outside of your relationship could still say, like, I don't want to marry Duncan, but he is lovely. And for me to be on the outside of that, I was going, I really don't want to ride that horse. But if you love it, then that's great. And he did, and he loved the horse. And so I think that chemistry is a great thing, but having an outside, like, really objective opinion does help to
go back to what you're saying about chemistry. I find is what I often will do when clients are undecided, if we find a few problems, is ask them for their tick boxes. You know, what are you looking for? If this is your young daughter who's going to get on it, you want suitability, you want temperament. You know, if you've got a subtle hind limb lameness that we can manage, That's a tiny little box. The big box is temperament.
Yeah.
Are you going to safely put your daughter on that horse, or yourself for that matter? You know, if the horse is bomb-proof and you just know you can walk away and leave your daughter riding, that's worth its weight in gold. You know, if you've got a little blemish on an eye or on a backside or on a, you know, that's a small little box. We can deal with that. So I think suitability, as you said, and chemistry is hugely important.
Oh, but temperaments, and just from a production point of view, I think we tend to overlook temperaments. You know, we can all be taken with. There was a dealer who used to say, he said, I can sell anything that's a dappled grey or a bay with 4 white socks. Anyone will buy it. It doesn't matter if it's psychotic. But I think temperaments, for anyone listening, I really do think that's, as from a training perspective, you're never going to go wrong. You can always do something with them. I did want to touch on where you were talking about veterinary history. What happens if a buyer goes to vet a horse? They do an extensive vet check because the seller hasn't done it. They ultimately decide not to take the horse. The buyer owns, the ex-buyer owns that vet check. What would the next, I mean, the horse doesn't need to be x-rayed 82 times by 82 prospective buyers.
No,
should the seller buy the x-rays, or should the next buyer request, I mean, you know, because there is an expense attached.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I often encourage transfer of that kind of those documents, whether it's a vetting. Very often, if somebody walks away and goes, it's just outside my risk tolerance, and I will often be asked to go and vet it for another person, the first thing I'll do is ask permission to discuss, because obviously I can't discuss without permission, the right permissions. Yes, you're right. It shouldn't be re-x-rayed and re-x-rayed, and there's a health and safety concern, if nothing else, irradiating everyone. So yes, it is. I often will say to the seller, let's say the sale doesn't go through, I'll say to the seller, well, offer them half for the x-rays, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then the buyer has walked away and made a little bit of money, got some money back, and the seller now owns an up-to-date set of x-rays that they can pass on to anyone.
That's a really
I mean,
good idea.
they might not want the x-rays if they're an absolute mess. But
Absolutely.
But I think that's part of the problem is when sellers start saying, no, I'm not prepared to give you the medical history. Yeah, there are x-rays, I'm not prepared. Ringing bells need to be start going
Red
off here.
flags.
Why do you not want to give me the
100%.
medical history? And that's just something to be aware of.
it's like you said at the beginning, it's transparency.
Yeah.
I
If you
like
want
that
to be
word.
known, you know, this world is this equine industry is too small.
So small.
In this country especially, you know, you sell one bad one, or there's, you know, you can sell a bad one unknowingly, and it's
No,
how you deal with it
absolutely. I
afterwards.
think
And I'm
that's
very, to the guys I vet for, dealers, that I'll often say, listen, you've got to do the right thing here, you know, and if I genuinely think that this was an inherent problem, whether it be a lameness or be a schizo or whatever it is, I think you probably, if you want to keep your name going in the industry, you need to do the right thing. Not that it's my business, but because on the day the horse may vet fine.
And Patrick, in general, do you find most of the dealers are quite happy to do that?
Yes, to some degree or other they are. I mean,
It's
most of the
reputational.
reputational ones and the good ones that I vet for are very, very good like that.
Yeah.
Look, it may not be, without going into detail, a straight cash refund. They'll say, listen, I'll find you another one. And they will find them another one that is hopefully more suitable or whatever. So yes, I do find, I mean, I don't carry that much sway. I am a third party, as you would know. I'm not in the transaction. I'm just an advisory for the buyer. But they often will, I like to have a very good rapport with the sellers, because I think this is an open, transparent transaction. That's the way it should be. And it should be, we should be able to discuss at the horse's side. The horse has a turned-in foot.
What are the
or
reasonable-
It's boxy. You know, I talk when I'm doing my vettings. I don't want to tell a seller it's all fine. Then I go back if the buyer's living in
Get a
Cape
dirty
Town
vet check.
and go, it was awful. And they go and go, but he didn't tell me. He told me it was fine. So I try and be very transparent, obviously with permission from the buyer. But I think the only way to do it is to be transparent, because sellers soften then and they realize that their horse is perfect, or they know. But and I think it helps the whole transaction. I really do.
And I think ultimately, which I hope we always keep coming back to, the point is, when you said like you're the mediator between it, it's for the welfare of the horse.
Yeah.
You know, so we want full disclosure, mostly to help the horse and do that. So Janine, we did discuss this briefly in the beginning. The horse has been perhaps misrepresented to the buyer, And I do think buyers need to be very wary of throwing that term around misrepresented, where you very rightly said earlier on, well, the horse is ready for EM dressage, and now a prelim buyer buys it and says, well, it can't do EM dressage.
I did it EM dressage and it did terribly.
Yes,
And you're
exactly.
Can you ride at that level?
So I think there's the difference between misrepresentation and then fluctuation of reasonable abilities, which happens. And even then, even if you're a great rider, I've had this, sometimes you get on a horse and you look like an idiot because, you're just speaking a different language. But if a horse has perhaps been willfully misrepresented and a buyer has landed up with an unsound horse or an unsuitable horse, or is there any recourse that they could have?
There is recourse, but it's not an easy road to travel. So your recourse would be, unfortunately, either arbitrating, mediating, alternative dispute resolution, or going to the court. You would try and cancel the agreement. You could say to the seller, you've misrepresented this horse. Had I known X, Y, and Z about the horse, I wouldn't
I knew it had its tongue over the bits when
I would never have bought the horse in the
with the
first
bins.
place. And that information was the reason I did buy the horse, because you'll often find that. So somebody's saying, this horse wins every 90s class it jumps, and mommy wants to have her child win every 90s class. So she buys the horse without doing her homework and checking up on show
and
jumping.
without buying the child that was winning.
Maybe that was
that's what
part
she
of the
should have
problem.
done.
Is then to say that was a clear misrepresentation. You would then have to go the route of saying, I want to cancel the agreement. Basically, I'll give you the horse back, you give me the purchase price back. The fact that these things haven't come up, or that they're not reported cases, makes me think that this hasn't often happened, or that if it happens, people both walk away unhappy about it. So often,
I think that's the definition of a good compromise, is everyone's been unhappy.
well, that's a good negotiation, yes. Everybody leaves very
I
upset.
think from a veterinary point of view as well, the cases that I have been involved in where there has been a straightforward return, whether it's been a refund or another horse is a different story, is being able to prove pre-existing.
Yeah.
So, let's say they don't, it's not a legal requirement to x-ray a horse.
Okay. Yeah.
So
No, it's not,
you get the horse home, and 2 weeks later it's bucking or it's lame. You go to your vet, you do a workup, and it turns out it's got a great big chip with secondary arthritis in the joint. Now that takes months, if not years, to develop. So that it's easy. Any expert will sit there and say that pre-existed 3 months ago.
Yeah.
So that it's not easy. As you said, you have to invest lots of money going through the courts if the seller wants to be a bit uppity. But being able to prove a pre-existing condition is very helpful in furthering your case. But you need to prove it. But there is also a lot of it is subjective. So we've mentioned maybe the rider's not up to it. Maybe this actually is a quirky horse. And the rider can't ride half the horse.
In Janine's case, the from 1960, whatever, the seller actually turned around and said, well, I could ride that horse, so I assumed the buyer could ride it.
Yes,
That
I
was
saw
the
you
fence.
over the fence and you looked like you could ride, so I assumed you'd be able to ride the horse.
I think, there's another point that I do think that there is pathology that will only show itself with different riders. I think we often see that horrible condition, kissing spines, which is grossly overblamed for a lot of behavioral issues. But a rider may have learned how to ride their horse and be sympathetic to whatever that horse's problem may be.
And conditioned it.
It now goes to a new home, a new surface, a new riding calendar, schedule, trainer, saddle, and suddenly what wasn't a problem has become a problem. And I have seen that. I have often known the horse before and after and said, before, that horse never had a problem. Now it's got a problem. We knew it had kissing spines.
And
We
that's
might
really
have commented
interesting.
on it. But for some reason, the new rider, maybe it's posture, weight distribution, just weight. All of those have come to play and now brought a problem. That is now not the seller's problem.
No.
And I will try and be fair and say, that's not the seller's. I knew this horse. This horse didn't do this before.
Well, I think also this is not the horse you bought. Whereas with a chip, that is the horse
Yes,
you bought.
exactly.
Yeah.
Pre-existing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's messy. I think it's messy. You have to prove a lot of things. And it's an expensive process. And at the end of the day, there's maybe one little girl that's most upset about the fact that she really loves this horse, and now she has to give it back. Because sometimes they just want to love the horse.
Yeah. Poor horses, they all deserve love.
But I think, Georgie, that's also why the Consumer Protection Act applying to something like horses would be really difficult. You know, if you think about a cooling off period, so after 6 months you can give back the goods.
The Consumer Protection Act is 30 days.
But that's what I'm saying. But this is a horse. You know, it's not a
And a lot can also happen to a horse in 30 days. You know,
what gets on the horse box to travel to the new home, it's now out of the seller's.
Janine, you actually said this earlier on, that possession is 9/10 of the law. So we were talking about dealers as opposed to a direct owner who is the seller to buyer. The owner will sometimes send the horse to a dealer. And this is, again, because we're moving towards discussing what an agreement should encompass. A dealer then, you said, once they take possession of the horse is effectively theirs from a legal...
No, but the problem is, so without having signed, the problem is that when we take ownership of a horse, ownership passes when the horse has been transferred from one to the other. But that transfer that happens has to also happen with an intent. So I intend to buy the horse, you intend to sell the horse. The intent was there. There's a cause for us to do this agreement. I want to buy a horse, you want to sell a horse. And I've paid the price, be that in kind, donation, whatever it happened.
In kind.
In kind. Maybe in kind, yes, maybe.
I want to know more about this, but carry on.
South Africa, anything's possible. But it's to say, then ownership actually passes. So you could have a situation where I bought a horse at the same yard where I ride. The horse is going to be still stabled at that yard. So it itself hasn't moved, but the intention of the parties' minds are now that horse is now mine and no longer the yard's horse. What happens often, and what concerns me, is when horses go to dealers and whether that horse has now been transferred. It now lives at the dealer. And I think it's regarding leasing as well. And I know we're not going to touch on that now, but it is something that we need to, at some stage, really discuss. Is the dealer then representing that it owns the horse? So that, in my mind, when you use a dealer to sell your horse, the seller, make sure there's an agreement between you and the dealer so that there's no misrepresentation about the fact that that horse is still owned by the owner and no longer by, or not by the dealer, unless the agreement is that the dealer does take ownership and pays basically the seller, and it takes the risks then on selling the horse. But that usually doesn't happen. Usually what it's on almost like, I want to say concession, sounds terrible, but that it holds the horse, it will advertise the horse, it will show the horse, it might school the horse in between.
Listen, you're also seeing virtual dealers, which I think is a problem, and there is no way to mitigate it. And this is something that's come up, that dealers are reselling horses that they haven't actually seen. And this is one of the things that's been coming up, that they're recommending horses and connecting and then coming for a commission. So
I would be wary of somebody who...
No, of course. It's you know, and I think, again, it comes down to the point which is that SAEF is as part of their program and development, is they're going to be having registered coaches and registered yards ultimately on the website, and to align yourselves always with choosing somebody who's
got recognition.
And also they've got something to lose. You know, if things do go wrong, they have a reputational investment.
I think, you know, as things have developed, you know, that was 1969. You know, trading horses in this country has gone to an absolute another stratosphere. And I do think the good dealers are good. They have too much reputational damage at risk. And they're not, that's what they do for a living. You know, whether they're the kid's trainer or a genuine dealer, there will always be the shysters of this world that are going to, you know, you've got to be careful. But they generally are easy to pick out those.
Totally.
You know, that's when the buyer has to be very beware. But I think generally most of the good dealers want a good, open, transparent transaction.
They want you to bring your friend. They want you to get your next from them.
And they want it to be easy, you know. And so some of the guys I work for, or ladies, they don't want to take on a horse with problems because they don't want to have to sell a horse then go through this road that Janine's just been talking about, because now there's comeback They're not interested in that. That's just too much aggro for them. So they want the horse that has a clean set of x-rays, a clean initial vetting, a good then proper vetting.
Good temperament.
And hopefully that's the whole deal. Transaction goes nice and smooth and everyone's happy.
Yeah, done
But
and dusted.
the coming back is aggro, whether you intended to or not, it's aggro for everyone. And they don't want to do it. Yeah.
Listen, I think we've been talking about really looking after buyers, I think, in this, but I have to tell you that I think I've dealt one horse on in my life, and I ran down the driveway crying when he left, so I was never allowed to deal another horse again in my life. But the cost and the time that is involved in what these dealers do, and they assume a lot of risk. So I think for however many, and again, statistics I'm always fascinated by, but I don't think there are these. For every 10 horses they buy, there's going to be one that they just don't get to sell, And then for the remaining of those 9 horses, then 3 get a poor vet check and they have to negotiate. So then you've got 30% of your horses, which are really carrying the cost of the entire operation. And the schooling and the deworming and the letting them down and then fattening them up. And I do think that dealers, as you say, the good horse sellers, dealers sounds like such a dirty word. The good horse sellers really do deserve, any success that they do have. But moving on, let's discuss the agreement. So if you're going to buy a horse, sell a horse, you should have an agreement in place between one another.
I would say a simple agreement. So I'm not talking about a 50-page thesis on simple agreement. Who's the buyer? Who's the seller? What is the object of the sale? It's the horse. Describe the horse fully. If you've got the ID page, perfect. Put that in. It's a very clear distinction of what the horse looks like, microchip number, all of those things. Try and put as much detail like that in, but keep the agreement in simple English. One of the things that the SAEF has been in the process of trying to do is make those kinds of agreements, just basic template agreements, available to our members. They can have a look at it. Adapt it for their own purposes. But I think having a written agreement is important. So where you say that you have represented that this horse is bomb-proof, what does bomb-proof mean? Totally. But what I'm saying is that this horse is suited for a beginner child rider. You have made those representations so that if it then goes wrong and the seller has signed the agreement, you can say, but look, you've agreed that this is what you've represented. The horse is not. The horse is, in fact, a maniac and wants to try and kill and eat everybody. So then it makes your proof a little bit easier. It makes your case a lot easier. Be specific about your agreement, but make it simple. Okay. And I think it's to me, the most important thing about any agreement is make it as simple as possible. Don't try and have convoluted language, legalistic language, simple English, short sentences.
And that has to be between the seller and the buyer, not the dealer and the buyer.
Yeah, the seller and the buyer. And actually, one of the things I thought about, Georgie, and we're not discussing it now, but it struck my mind for the Equestrian Federation in any event. When you have a passport and your horse competes and you now sell the horse on, you have to do a change of ownership forms, and the disciplines will ask you for it and the SAEF will ask you for it because they actually stamp the ownership page as you do it. So whoever's name is in the passport, there should be a little stamp next to it, and then you go and you sell it and there's a change of ownership. Never, ever, as a seller, sign a blank change of ownership form. Ever. So always as the seller, make sure that the purchase as the seller, because you have no idea, for all you know, you sign a blank thing, they write one of your top horses, 500,000, name in, and the buyer goes, I've bought this horse. And the next thing they represent, and they say, look, we've bought this horse, that person signed. So just be wary, and that's what you're talking about, the sellers.
And that change of ownership should, I am assuming, only happen when the agreement's signed, the money is paid.
Money has changed, transfer has happened.
And the horse wouldn't be able to compete with somebody who's not hopefully, right?
Well, remember we have horses that are leased as well, where I'll pitch up at a show with a passport. It's not my name in the passport. It's either a school pony or I'm leasing the pony. So that's not always the case. But if I wanted to register the horse on, say, for instance, Dressage's website, and I wanted to say, I want to be responsible for putting in vaccines, everything else, Dressage will say to me, well, do you own the pony now? And I'll say, yes, I own the pony now. And they'll say, well, can we have a change of ownership, please?
Okay.
So those are the things.
Create the paper trail. And I suppose, again, the helpful thing is if I go back 3 owners and I see that Patrick owned the horse, I can come to you and say, can I have those veterinary records?
Yeah.
again. Okay, that's interesting. A last note from sellers, and I spoke to a couple of friends when we discussed that we were going to do this, and one of the people who I spoke to is Lynette Duplessis from Pony Perfection, and she said, like, it's great that you're talking about what the onus is, you know, the responsibilities of the seller, but the buyers also do have some responsibilities. And you asked me this earlier on. And I thought a couple of the things that she said really were just very thoughtful and very courteous. And one of the things that she said, to be on time for appointments when you're going to go and try a horse. You know, everyone's built their day around that. They are running a business. When you're going to go and try a horse, don't be dishonest about your level of experience. And I had someone, Janine's laughing. I mean, it's just the stupidest thing to lie about. I worked overseas at one stage, and a girl lied about her experience to come and ride racehorses with us. And she broke her coccyx within 3 days. And it was just, we were just like, why would you? And she very clearly could not even rise at the trot. And one of the trainers, like top, it was being exported. It took off like a man out of a cannon down the long side. And I was just, so, and that's for people's safety as well as the fact that you don't want someone destroying your horse. She spoke about, but a few sellers have said this to me, that a lot of people go to try horses that are perhaps out of their budget with the hope that they can use the vetting to knock the price down. And I think, Janine, you said this very nicely earlier on, it's the intention again. So going to go and try a 500,000 Rand horse with the 500,000 Rand that you're able to buy, and the horse turns out to have a little bit of wear and tear that you're going to have to maintain, you negotiate, is a very different discussion to knowingly going to go and try a horse.
And finding fault with it so that I can now reduce the price. You say, oh, you see, but this and this and this happens. Yeah.
I certainly have found myself in positions where I have had buyers say, can you not just find something on the x-rays? Yeah. And I'm like, no, because very often I am being a mediator and advising the seller that they're going to have to take a discount on this, offer a discount, because otherwise the client's likely to walk away. And I think it's the right thing to do. But if the horse is clean, it's clean. And there should be no...
What a joy.
Yeah. Then there is no angle for the buyer to negotiate anything. And so it should be. If as you both said, if you go and try the horse at that price and there is nothing wrong with it, then that is the price. If you can get a discount, great. But if you're not offering one, then I'm certainly not going to get some phantom pathology to try and negotiate a discount.
Totally. And then a closing point was my friend Siobhan Recourse, who is a stickler for the correct terminology in the world, said that there also should be, and again, it's impossible to, I think, really define this, but I think it's the role of, perhaps you said you need to get to know your clients before you choose or decide if the horse is the correct fit, is the terminology around trying horses and what the difference is between, for example, someone said, well, this horse is backed. And what they meant is someone has sat on its back. It is not what I would consider back, just to be perfectly clear. So I think all of the descriptions that go into selling a horse and the representation from a seller also needs to be carefully considered. And I don't know if there is a way of creating almost a glossary of terms.
There could be, but I think part of the podcast and this drive of education is for people to listen, to read, to skill up themselves. If you're going to be involved in equestrian sport, know the rules.
And to ask someone what their definition of back is.
So we were talking about the horse that was sold that was 15 8 hands.
Yeah, a 15 8 hand high, 3-year-old advanced stallion me.
Yes. And all of that immediately should be going, no, it's like the 52 lost thoroughbreds.
52 thoroughbreds running down the N1.
So it's just to be careful, but do your homework. You know, find out you're going to get involved in the sport either as a mom or as a rider yourself. Get involved. You know, find out what there is to find out. Read up on things. Look at the rules sometimes. You know, it does no harm. And then you're a lot more equipped when you go and buy your first horse, because you then understand what you're looking for. I know there's always these funny quips about when people say horse is ideal for children or not a novice horse, has no vices, but it bites and kicks sometimes.
One of my friends actually had a great her child has fallen off and broken a collarbone. I think, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it is right now, but she had the child went to go visit the pony, and the pony had a sign around its neck saying, "Pony for sale, great with kids." And she took a photo of the child in the cast standing next to the looking completely shocked. But and again, I think the devil's in the details. And to your point, that agreement has to be, as opposed to saying, the horse is bomb-proof. No horse is bomb-proof. What do you define?
Well, what do
as
you want
being-
the horse to be able to do? I want the horse to be able to, that I can put my 10-year-old on, who has very little experience, and she can go hacking around the block with me, and I know that the horse is relatively safe. Horses are animals, they're
I've got
not
a friend who
robots.
says, "Can I put my granny on it?"
Yes.
And I always love that. And he says, and then, you'll get someone who'll say, "Well, what does your granny want to do? Are you going to lead your granny? Or is your granny going to try and
Do PR.
is your granny Annelie Vogefenning?" Because they
Yes.
know, So yeah, I think it's having a little bit more detail and knowing and just thinking to be thoughtful about those questions and have the hard conversations about the commission chain, for example, which is a phrase that's never going to leave me, Patrick. Thank you. And I think the worst thing about vetting horses is always the realization that you can vet a horse sound. It can be a wonderful horse. You can get it home next week and it can, it's
Break its leg.
So I think it's.
We don't have crystal balls.
We don't have crystal
That's the
balls,
reality.
yeah.
That's why we talk about risk.
Yeah.
The likelihood is X or Y. No one will know for sure. But I think I wanted to come back to the point. There is also an advice to, especially first-time buyers, is to keep the emotion out of it. Too often
That's
I go and vet
yeah.
horses,
But I love
and
it.
I can see there's a pink. I call it the pink mist. They call it, it doesn't matter what the vetting is going to say. They're taking the horse, whatever I say.
Okay.
And they rather have to, the thought of them having to unclutch their 5-year-old daughter from the pony's neck, screaming, is just too much.
Listen,
for
that's
them.
easier.
They're
You
taking the
can
horse.
actually pull the 5-year-old off. It's when it's a 35-year-old.
Yeah, well,
And
Yes.
true.
I've had that with a friend who took a horse from Highveld Horse Care, and she God bless her, because she was like, "I realize everything that you're saying, and I realize I'm in for another $5,000 a month, but he must come home with me."
Yeah. But again,
So-
that's eyes wide open. If they understand that, then
Yeah.
they understand.
as long as there's, as
But
you
people
say,
mustn't get too attached until the necessary checks have been done. I find that does blur a few decision making.
and I think Lynette also did mention this endless trying of horses. If you've tried it 2 or 3 times and you think you're going to vet it, because that might be the thing that changes your mind.
Correct.
But also don't just waste time and go for free riding lessons on.
I was just thinking. If somebody who desperately wants to ride but can't afford riding lessons, so all they do is keep on trying out different
It
horses
sounds
every
like
week.
another Jilly Cooper novel. It's magical. Okay, guys, I think that's everything. Anything else that you need to cover?
I actually wanted to ask, and Patrick, more so, it's something that the vets do, and I've now, through the SAEF, seen quite a bit of it, is when you do bloods. So you're vetting the horse and you would do bloods. Do you test the blood immediately? Do you send it off to the clinic immediately, or
Are bloods a routine thing?
yeah,
Or only on
is that a
That's
routine
a very
or
good question. I personally have made it now a routine.
That's good.
I think there's, for the effort involved, I think I've stopped trying to target horses I would test. I think that's probably unfair on the seller, and it avoids any awkward questions. I just now say, I'm taking blood and it's going to be in the freezer for 6 months. Unless somebody decides that they actually, some people will want it sent away straight away. It will delay the sale by maybe only a week.
Are bloods expensive to run, or do you have to
Yeah.
decide what you're running
It's
for?
about 2,000 Rand.
Okay.
I just remember. So they will do a screen for sedatives, the ACPs and all that of this world, and they'll do a screen of anti-inflammatories.
Okay.
So, and it's a very good question. And it's actually quite topical at the moment because we've had a couple come back positive for the last 6 months,
Okay.
which have raised my eyebrows and gone, ooh, okay.
Okay.
It does, in terms of making you strengthen your case. If you have bloods and they come back negative, okay, you're no stronger. But if they come back positive,
yeah.
it's a problem. you
Well, I
know,
was just going to
and-
say, so if we talk about the duty to disclose, in terms of our old Roman Dutch law, we have to disclose 4 feet, 4 sound feet. if I'm having to medicate my horse to appear sound, I am then not disclosing.
Outrageous.
I've already stepped over that boundary. I've already now
Unless
fraudulently
you
misrepresented.
disclose it and say,
Yeah, unless you disclose to say, I've given my horse, Previcox, or I've sedated it a little bit.
I
Because
would love to invite someone to vet a horse having given it some reserpine and.
but it's happened recently. It's happened recently just that a horse was treated with just maintenance, nothing serious. And a sale, well, I'm assuming, because I do know the clients, suddenly was not sprung on them a bit, but an offer was made. But it was within the withdrawal period.
Yeah.
And I have spoken to the other vets and everything, and I've said, that's what I saw. It was just maintenance. The horse wasn't lame. And all parties have been amicable about it and gone, okay, we understand that horses get treated. We understand it was treated however many weeks ago. So it, once again, if the transparency is there, then there's no excuses, not for sellers, buyers, anyone,
But I think that's essence is if you're prepared to be transparent, it would make the buyers feel so much more comfortable. I think if you as a seller say, look, I did give the horse, anti-inflammatories a week ago because it had, it was at a show or whatever, I think being honest about it. And yes, I have x-rayed it. I x-ray it every 3 or 4 years because we've always been worried about the right foot. I think buyers then start feeling more comfortable with the seller saying, I trust this guy. They're being so upfront with everything. I feel more comfortable.
Supposed to going, no, it's perfect. It's fine. Never
The best horse ever.
never done that before. That's my favorite when I'm trying something.
Exactly.
It doesn't buck.
Yeah.
But I think to answer your question is, yes, I do bloods as routine now, but I don't send them off as routine. I only send them off the client requests. But otherwise, they get stored for 6 months, and then they get discarded.
Okay. So I think in recapping it, there have been a couple of really great points which I love. I think the first thing is vetting the horse for the correct purpose and the correct person, and I love what you speak about the mesh, so like what are your requirements, being very clear about those, communicating those clearly with the seller of the horse, asking a lot of questions, being very transparent, both parties. And I think the agreement is an essential thing. Do you have to have a lawyer draft an agreement? No.
Never.
Okay.
No, an agreement can be drafted by the seller and the buyer. And all they're doing is they're saying, instead of doing WhatsApps about, okay, well, I'll
It's
pay
on one
this.
document.
It's on one document. We both agreed it. And if you've both signed it, then that's an agreement. And now your terms are very clearly spelled out. And you don't have to fight about it. Hopefully you don't have to fight. But if there is a fight, you don't then have to fight about what did you actually mean. And that's why I'm saying keep it in plain English.
And I think what would be an important addition to that is one of our pages and I think most vets have it, is a vendor declaration, which is vices, medication, diseases, surgeries.
Okay.
You can say, you can put whatever you want in there and say, I want to know what it's had its whole life that you know about. And if you had that attached to your sale agreement and you declared that it never had any medication, but its blood test has come back positive or whatever, it's...
You can clearly...
Yeah.
It's
And actually, I would even attach maybe like the passport. If the horse has a passport, its ownership page, its ID page, its vaccination
Listen,
page.
I've seen a passport before with the date of birth. It had some Tipex on it.
Okay, sorry.
And I think those are, again, so speaking to the point about just education, and a good vet would say,
this is a problem.
Like, what is this?
Yeah.
So I think one of the most exciting things that could possibly happen to any equestrian, getting their first four-legged friend. I hope that this podcast was a little bit informative. We didn't actually get any questions on the live feed. Perhaps there's an error on my laptop. That seems unlikely. But if there are any questions, please pop them through to podcast@saf.org.za. We're also always looking for more topics. Our next topic, I believe, is going to be
Safeguarding.
About safeguarding with Guardian, which is going to be the SAEF safeguarding app. That's following in the footsteps of safe sport initiatives which have been run in the United States. I think we can all agree that's really essential and great, and really looking forward to speaking to the person from Guardian about that. Patrick, our veterinary wunderkind, and Janine, our lawyer at arms, thank you for joining us this evening. And good luck, everyone, and happy vetting.